The dust kicked up around Parker Preston's boots as he stood outside the general store in Superior, Arizona territory, staring at the notice board with a mixture of frustration and desperation weighing heavy on his shoulders. His ranch was failing, not from lack of land or cattle, but from lack of hands to work it. And the September heat of 1885 was not making anything easier as sweat trickled down his back beneath his worn cotton shirt. "Need to hire someone soon or I will lose everything Pa built," Parker muttered to himself, his calloused fingers tracing the edge of the paper he had just pinned to the board. The notice was simple. Farmhand wanted. Hard work. Fair pay. Ask for Parker Preston. He was 28 years old, broad-shouldered and strong from years of ranch work, with sun-darkened skin and hands that knew the feel of rope and leather better than anything else. His father had died 2 winters ago, leaving him the ranch and all its burdens, and his mother had followed 6 months later, her heart simply giving out from grief. Now Parker worked alone, and the weight of it was crushing him slowly but surely. The door to the general store swung open and old Marcus Webb stepped out, his weathered face creasing into concern as he saw Parker. "Any luck finding help?" "Just put up the notice," Parker replied, pushing his hat back on his head. "Figure someone passing through might need work." "Most folks passing through Superior are heading somewhere else," Marcus said. "Mining towns up north are pulling everyone away with promises of silver." Parker knew he was right. The Arizona territory was wild and unpredictable in 1885, with opportunities scattered like seeds in the wind. Why would anyone want to work on a struggling cattle ranch when they could chase dreams of striking it rich? "I will keep trying," Parker said, though his voice lacked conviction. He spent the rest of the day in town, buying supplies he could barely afford and trying not to think about the cattle that needed moving, the fences that needed mending, and the 100 other tasks piling up like storm clouds. As the sun began its descent toward the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Parker loaded his wagon and prepared for the hour-long journey back to his ranch. That was when he heard the commotion near the edge of town. A small crowd had gathered around the stagecoach station, voices rising in that particular mix of curiosity and concern that always drew attention. Parker probably should have minded his own business, but something pulled him toward the gathering, his boots carrying him across the dusty street before he made a conscious decision to move. "I paid for passage to Tucson," a woman's voice rang out, clear and firm despite the obvious exhaustion threading through it. "The ticket agent in El Paso assured me this coach would take me there." "Well, the ticket agent in El Paso was wrong, miss," the stagecoach driver replied, not unkindly but with the weariness of a man who had this conversation too many times. "This line only goes as far as Superior. You want to get to Tucson, you will need to wait for next week's coach." "Next week?" The woman's voice cracked slightly. "I cannot wait here a week. I have no money for lodging, and I need to reach Tucson to meet my brother." Parker pushed through the small crowd until he could see her clearly. She stood beside the stagecoach, one worn carpetbag at her feet, her dress covered in the dust of hard travel. But it was her face that struck him, the determined set of her jaw even as worry flickered in her dark eyes, the way she held herself straight despite obvious fatigue. She looked to be in her early 20s, with rich brown hair pulled back in a practical bun and skin that had seen sun but not the harsh weathering of years of outdoor labor. "Miss, I am sorry, but there is nothing I can do," the driver said. "Company rules are company rules." "Then I will walk," she said, and Parker could hear she meant it. "Walk?" The driver laughed, though not cruelly. "Miss, it is over 100 miles to Tucson through desert and rough country. You would not make it 10 miles on foot." Parker found himself stepping forward before he could think better of it. "Excuse me, miss." She turned to look at him, and up close he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, the faint freckles across her nose, the way her lips pressed together as if holding back words that wanted to spill out. "I could not help but overhear your situation," Parker continued, suddenly aware that everyone was now looking at him. "If you are in need of work, I have a position available, room and board included. It would give you time to earn enough for proper passage to Tucson and whatever else you might need." Her eyes narrowed slightly, studying him with an intelligence that made him feel assessed and measured. "What kind of position?" "Farmhand," Parker said, then added quickly, "Ranch hand, really. I run a cattle ranch about an hour from here. The work is hard but honest. I need help with the daily operations, everything from mending fences to tending livestock." "I am a woman," she said bluntly. "I noticed," Parker replied, feeling heat rise to his face. "But if you can do the work, I do not care about that. I need help, and you need a place to stay and a way to earn money. Seems like it might solve both our problems." She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze never leaving his face. Parker had the uncomfortable feeling she was reading every thought in his head, weighing his intentions and character in a way that left him feeling exposed. "My name is Florence Wright," she finally said. "And I should tell you, I have never worked on a ranch before. Can you learn?" "I can learn anything," she said with such conviction that Parker believed her without question. "Then we have an agreement, Miss Wright," he said, extending his hand. She looked at his offered hand, then placed her smaller one in it. Her grip was firm, her palm calloused in a way that told him she knew hard work even if she had never specifically worked on a ranch. "We have an agreement, Mr. Preston." "Just Parker," he said. "Just Florence, then," she replied. The crowd began to disperse, the entertainment over, and the stagecoach driver tipped his hat to them both before climbing back up to his seat. Parker picked up Florence's carpetbag, surprised by how light it was, how few possessions this woman seemed to carry with her. "My wagon is this way," he said, leading her back toward the general store where he had left it loaded with supplies. Florence followed him silently, and Parker found himself hyper-aware of her presence behind him, the soft sound of her footsteps, the rustle of her travel-worn skirts. What had he just done? He had gone into town looking for a farmhand and come back with a woman who admitted she had no ranch experience. It was impulsive and possibly foolish, but something in her eyes had spoken to him, some combination of determination and desperation that he recognized because he saw it in his own mirror every morning. "I should tell you about the arrangement," Parker said as they reached the wagon. He helped her up onto the bench seat, then climbed up beside her. "The ranch house is small but decent. 2 bedrooms, which means you will have your own private space. I will expect you to work from sunup to sundown most days, with Sundays off for rest. Meals are provided and I will pay you fair wages weekly." "How much?" Florence asked directly. Parker named a sum that was probably more than he should offer given his finances, but it seemed only right. "Plus room and board," he added. Florence nodded slowly. "That is more than fair, I accept." As Parker guided the wagon out of Superior, heading east toward his ranch, the sun continued its descent. The landscape around them was quintessentially Arizona territory in 1885, harsh and beautiful in equal measure. Saguaro cacti stood like sentinels against the darkening sky, and the mountains in the distance were purple shadows against the horizon. "Tell me about Tucson," Parker said after they had ridden in silence for several minutes. "Your brother there?" "Yes," Florence said. "At least, that is what his last letter said. He went out west 2 years ago looking for work and ended up in Tucson. I was supposed to meet him there, start a new life." What happened? I mean, why did you leave where you were?" Florence was quiet for so long that Parker thought she might not answer. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of old pain. "I was in St. Louis. My husband died a year ago, fever took him. After he passed, I had nothing keeping me there. My brother wrote saying I should come west, that there were opportunities here for people willing to work hard. I sold everything I had for the train and stage fare, but I must have been cheated somewhere along the way because the tickets did not take me as far as I was promised." "I am sorry," Parker said. "About your husband." "Thank you," Florence replied simply. Parker wanted to ask more, wanted to know everything about this woman who had suddenly entered his life, but he sensed she had shared what she was willing to share for now. Instead, he talked about the ranch, describing the land and the cattle, the creek that ran through the property and provided water, the small house his father had built with his own hands. "It sounds like a good place," Florence said softly. "It is," Parker agreed. "Or it was. It could be again, with help." The ranch appeared as the last light was fading from the sky, the house a dark shape against the purple twilight. Parker guided the wagon to the barn, and together they unloaded the supplies. Florence insisted on helping despite her obvious exhaustion from days of travel, and Parker appreciated her immediately pitching in without complaint. Inside the house, Parker lit lanterns and showed Florence to what had been his parents' bedroom. He had not been able to bring himself to sleep in it after they died, preferring his own smaller room, and now he was glad he had left it empty. "It is not fancy," he said, setting her carpetbag on the simple wooden bed frame with its rope supports and straw mattress. "But the roof does not leak and the bed is sturdy." Florence looked around the small room, taking in the simple furnishings, the window that looked out toward the mountains. "It is perfect," she said, and he could hear the sincerity in her voice. "Thank you, Parker, for this chance." "Thank me after a week of work," Parker said with a slight smile. "You might hate it here by then." "I will not," Florence said with that same conviction she had shown earlier. Parker left her to settle in and went to the kitchen to prepare a simple meal of beans and cornbread. His cooking was serviceable but nothing special, born of necessity rather than skill. When Florence emerged from her room 20 minutes later, she had changed into a simpler dress and tied her hair back more practically. "Let me help," she said, moving into the kitchen without waiting for permission. They worked together in companionable silence, and Parker found himself noticing small things about her. The efficient way she moved, wasting no motion. The slight furrow between her eyebrows when she concentrated. The way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear when it fell forward. They ate at the small wooden table, and Parker explained what the next day would bring. "I will start you with simpler tasks," he said. "Feeding the chickens, collecting eggs, that sort of thing. Then we will move on to the barn work, mucking stalls and such. I need to ride out to check on the herd tomorrow, but that can wait until you have your bearings." "I can ride," Florence said, "if you need someone to come with you. You know horses." "My father had a small farm in Missouri before he passed. I grew up around animals, even if I never worked cattle specifically." This information changed things slightly. Parker had assumed Florence had no experience whatsoever with rural life, but if she had grown up on a farm, she might adapt more quickly than he had expected. "We will see how tomorrow goes," Parker said, "but that is good to know." After dinner, Florence insisted on washing the dishes despite Parker's protests. He finally gave in, recognizing that she needed to feel useful, needed to earn her keep from the very first night. While she worked, he stepped outside onto the small porch, looking up at the stars that had emerged in full force now that night had completely fallen. The Arizona Territory sky was always spectacular, but tonight it seemed even more so, as if the universe was marking this day as significant. Parker wondered what his parents would think of what he had done today, bringing a strange woman to the ranch to work alongside him. His mother probably would have been concerned about propriety, about what people might say. His father, more practical in his thinking, would have asked if she could do the work. Parker supposed he would find out soon enough. When he came back inside, Florence was wiping down the table, her movements slow now as exhaustion finally caught up with her. "You should get some rest," Parker said gently. "Tomorrow will be a long day." "Yes," Florence agreed, not arguing. "Good night, Parker." "Good night, Florence." He watched her disappear into her room, heard the soft sound of the door closing, and then stood alone in the main room of the house that suddenly felt less empty than it had in months. Parker had lived with loneliness so long that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to have another presence in his home, the simple awareness that someone else was breathing and existing in the rooms nearby. He lay awake in his own bed for a long time that night, staring at the ceiling and wondering if he had made a terrible mistake or the best decision of his life. Time would tell, he supposed. Time always did. The rooster crowed before dawn, and Parker rose from bed with the automatic movements of years of habit. He dressed quickly in work clothes, splashed water on his face from the basin in his room, and emerged into the main room to start coffee. He was surprised to find Florence already in the kitchen, her hair braided and pinned up, wearing a dress that looked more suited to work than the one she had worn the day before. "You are up early," Parker said. "So are you," Florence replied, taking the coffee pot from his hands. "Let me. You go do whatever you need to do to start the day, and I will have breakfast ready when you come back." Parker hesitated, unused to having someone else handle the morning routine, but then nodded. "All right. I will be in the barn feeding the horses." Outside, the world was that particular shade of gray that came just before sunrise, everything outlined in silver light. The air was cooler than it would be in a few hours, and Parker took a deep breath, appreciating the freshness of it. He made his way to the barn where his two horses, a gelding named Copper and a mare named Daisy, nickered softly at his approach. As he forked hay into their stalls and checked their water, Parker found his mind wandering to the woman currently in his kitchen. Florence Wright, a widow from St. Louis who had been trying to reach her brother in Tucson. What must it have taken for her to make that journey alone? The courage required to leave everything familiar and head into the unknown. When he returned to the house, the smell of frying bacon greeted him, along with the rich aroma of coffee. Florence had found his meager supplies and created a proper breakfast, with eggs and bacon, and even some of the biscuits he had bought in town warmed up and ready. "This looks wonderful," Parker said honestly as he sat down. "It is nothing fancy," Florence said, but he could see the pleasure in her eyes at his appreciation. They ate together as the sun began to rise outside the window, painting the world in shades of gold and orange. Parker explained the layout of the ranch in more detail, describing where the cattle usually grazed, the boundaries of his property, the creek that was a lifeline in this dry country. "I have about 200 head of cattle," he said. "Not a huge operation, but respectable. The challenge is managing them with limited help. Cattle need to be moved to fresh grazing, watched for illness or injury, protected from predators. And that is on top of all the other ranch work that needs doing." "What other work?" Florence asked, sipping her coffee. "Mending fences, maintaining the barn and outbuildings, caring for the horses and chickens, keeping up with repairs on the house and equipment." Parker ticked items off on his fingers. "Growing and storing feed for winter, hauling water during dry spells, dealing with any number of small crises that come up." It is endless, really. Then we should get started, Florence said, standing and beginning to clear the table. They washed dishes together. Then Parker led Florence outside to begin showing her the daily routine. First were the chickens, kept in a coop behind the house. Florence smiled when she saw them, a genuine smile that transformed her face from serious to almost girlish. "I always liked chickens," she said, scattering feed while the birds clucked and pecked around her feet. "They are foolish creatures, but entertaining." "That they are," Parker agreed, watching her move among them with easy confidence. Next came the horses, and here Florence truly showed her experience. She approached Copper and Daisy with the calm assurance of someone who understood equine nature, letting them sniff her hand before stroking their necks and speaking to them in a low, soothing voice. "They are beautiful animals," she said. "Well cared for." "They are important," Parker said. "Out here, a good horse can mean the difference between life and death." He showed her how he wanted the stalls cleaned, where to put the soiled hay, how much fresh hay to put down. Florence listened attentively, asking questions when something was unclear, and then set to work with a determination that impressed him. The work was dirty and unglamorous, but she did not shy away from it or complain. By mid-morning, they had completed the basic barn chores and Parker decided it was time to ride out and check on the herd. "You said you can ride?" he asked Florence. "Yes," she confirmed. "Then saddle up Daisy. She is gentle but smart. You will do well together." Parker saddled Copper while Florence worked with Daisy, and he was pleased to see she knew what she was doing with tack and saddle. Within minutes, they were both mounted and heading out across the ranch land. The ride took them along the creek, following its winding path through Parker's property. The cattle were scattered across the grassland, grazing peacefully, and Parker rode slowly through them, looking for any signs of trouble. Florence followed his lead, quiet and observant, taking everything in. "How long have you had this ranch?" she asked as they paused on a small rise overlooking a particularly scenic stretch of land. "My father homesteaded it 20 years ago," Parker said. "I was 8 years old when we came here. It was nothing but open land then. We built everything from scratch. It must be hard, managing it alone." "It is," Parker admitted. "I have been trying to keep it going since my parents passed, but it has been a struggle. That is why I needed to hire someone." "I am glad you did," Florence said quietly. "I was in a desperate situation yesterday. I did not know what I was going to do." Parker looked at her, sitting straight in the saddle with the sun highlighting the brown of her hair and the determined line of her jaw. "I am glad I could help," he said simply. They returned to the ranch house around noon, and Florence insisted on preparing lunch, while Parker worked on repairing a section of corral fence that had been worrying him for weeks. As he hammered new boards into place, he found himself glancing toward the house, seeing Florence moving past the window, and feeling something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. He pushed the feeling away. She was an employee, nothing more. A temporary solution to his labor shortage, until she earned enough money to continue to Tucson and her brother. It would be foolish to think of her as anything else. But that night, as they sat together at dinner, and Florence told him stories about growing up in Missouri, about her father's small farm and her mother's vegetable garden, Parker found himself laughing for the first time in months. And when Florence laughed too, her eyes crinkling at the corners and her whole face lighting up, he felt that stirring in his chest again, stronger this time. The days began to settle into a rhythm. Florence proved herself capable of learning quickly, tackling each new task Parker gave her with the same determined focus. She learned to rope fence posts, to drive the wagon, to recognize the signs of cattle illness. She was up before dawn each day and rarely stopped moving until after sunset. But it was not just her work ethic that impressed Parker. It was the way she seemed to breathe new life into the ranch, into his home. She found wildflowers growing near the creek and brought them back to put in a jar on the table. She discovered his mother's old recipe box and began experimenting with dishes that were far superior to Parker's simple cooking. She hummed while she worked, soft melodies that drifted through the house and barn. 2 weeks after Florence arrived, Parker realized he had stopped thinking of her as temporary. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he had begun imagining her as a permanent fixture of his life, and that realization scared him. They were working together to repair a section of roof on the barn when he finally worked up the courage to ask her something more personal. "Do you miss St. Louis?" Florence paused in her hammering, sitting back on her heels and wiping sweat from her forehead. "No," she said. "I thought I would, but I do not. That life feels like it belonged to someone else now." "What about your husband? Do you miss him?" It was perhaps too direct a question, but Florence did not seem offended. She was quiet for a moment, her gaze distant. "Samuel was a good man," she said slowly. "We married young, maybe too young. We were still figuring out how to be married when he got sick. I grieved him, I still do in a way, but I think I grieve more for what we never got to have than for what we had." Parker nodded, understanding more than he could say. "And your brother in Tucson? Are you anxious to get there?" Florence looked at him directly then, her brown eyes searching his face. "Should I be?" she asked softly. The question hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning that Parker was not quite ready to confront. "You should do whatever makes you happy," he finally said. "What if I am already doing that?" Florence asked. Parker's heart began to beat harder in his chest. "Are you saying you want to stay, beyond just saving up money for Tucson?" "I am saying," Florence said carefully, "that I am not in a hurry to leave, if that would be all right with you." "It would be more than all right," Parker said, and he heard the thickness in his own voice. They finished repairing the roof in silence, but it was a comfortable silence now, full of understanding and possibility. When they climbed down from the barn and stood in the yard, dust covering their clothes and the afternoon sun beating down on them, Parker made a decision. "Florence," he said, "I need to be honest with you about something." She turned to face him fully, waiting. "When I hired you, I needed a farmhand, someone to help with the work. But these past 2 weeks, you have become more than that. You have made this place feel like a home again. And I find myself hoping every day that you will not decide to leave." Florence's expression softened. "I am not planning to leave," she said. "Good," Parker said. "But I want to make sure I am not taking advantage of you, keeping you here when you have family waiting in Tucson." "My brother will understand if I write to him," Florence said. "He wanted me to come west and build a new life. I think I can do that here just as well as in Tucson." "I am glad," Parker said simply. That evening they sat together on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. It had become a habit, these quiet moments at the end of each day, and Parker looked forward to them more than he wanted to admit. "Can I ask you something?" Florence said after a while, "Of course." "Why did you never marry? A man with a ranch like this, I would think you would have wanted a family." Parker was quiet for a long moment, considering how to answer. "I suppose I was waiting," he finally said. "My parents had something special, a real partnership. I did not want to settle for less than that. And out here, opportunities to meet someone are limited. Most of my time was spent working the ranch with my father, and after he died, I was too busy trying to survive to think about courting." "That makes sense," Florence said. "What about you?" Parker asked. "Do you think you will marry again someday?" Florence turned to look at him, and even in the fading light he could see the intensity in her eyes. "I think," she said slowly, "that I would marry again if I found the right person." someone who treated me as an equal, who valued my work and my thoughts, someone I could build a life with. That seems like a reasonable set of requirements, Parker said, his mouth suddenly dry. I think so, Florence agreed. Another week passed and the work continued. They moved cattle to fresh grazing, repaired more fencing, harvested vegetables from the small garden Florence had begun tending. They worked side by side from dawn until dusk, and Parker marveled at how natural it felt, how well they moved together, anticipating each other's needs without having to speak. But more than the work, it was the small moments that began to add up. The way Florence's hand would brush against his when she passed him a tool, the sound of her laughter when he told a joke, the comfortable silences that stretched between them in the evenings, requiring no words to fill them. Parker found himself falling in love, though he tried to fight it at first. Florence was his employee, his hired hand. It seemed wrong somehow to think of her romantically when she was dependent on him for room and board. But the heart did not listen to logic, and Parker's heart was increasingly certain that Florence Wright was exactly the person he had been waiting for his entire life. It all came to a head one afternoon in early October, about 6 weeks after Florence had arrived. They were working together to bring in hay from the field, loading it onto the wagon to store in the barn for winter. The physical labor was demanding, and they worked in synchronized rhythm, forking hay onto the wagon bed in steady motions. Florence paused to wipe sweat from her face, and a strand of hair came loose from her braid, falling across her eyes. Without thinking, Parker reached out and tucked it behind her ear. His fingers lingered perhaps a moment too long against her cheek, and when Florence looked up at him, the expression in her eyes made his breath catch. "Parker," she said softly. "I am sorry," he said, pulling his hand back. "That was inappropriate." "Was it?" Florence asked. "Because I did not mind." They stood there in the field, surrounded by hay and afternoon sunshine, and Parker knew this was a moment that would change everything. He could step back, pretend nothing had happened, maintain the careful employer-employee boundary they had been dancing around for weeks. Or he could be honest, risk rejection and awkwardness, but possibly gain something incredible. "Florence," he said, making his decision. "I know this might not be proper or right, and if I am reading this situation completely wrong, please tell me and we will never speak of it again. But I need you to know that I have feelings for you. Strong feelings. You have brought light and life back to this ranch, to my world, and the thought of you eventually leaving to go to Tucson or anywhere else makes me feel like I am losing something precious." Florence set down her pitchfork carefully, never breaking eye contact with him. "You are not reading the situation wrong," she said quietly. "I have feelings for you too. I think I have since that first night when you shared your home and your table with a stranger. You have given me a place to belong, Parker, and more than that, you have treated me with respect and kindness. You have made me feel valued in a way I never felt before." "Then stay," Parker said, taking a step closer to her. "Not as my employee, stay as my partner, my equal. Stay and help me build this ranch into something great. Stay and let me court you properly, the way you deserve." "I would like that very much," Florence said, and her smile was radiant. Parker reached out and took her hand, his work-roughened palm against hers, and felt something settle in his chest, some piece of himself that had been misaligned clicking into place. "I should tell you," he said with a slight smile, "that I am not very experienced at courting. I might not be very good at it." "Neither am I," Florence admitted, "but I think we can figure it out together." From that day forward, everything shifted subtly but significantly. They were still working partners, still spending their days engaged in the hard labor of running a ranch, but now there was an acknowledged current of romance running beneath everything they did. Parker found himself looking for small ways to show Florence his affection. He would pick wildflowers for her on his rides to check the cattle. He made an effort to fix nice meals when it was his turn to cook, even if the results were sometimes questionable. Florence, in turn, showed her feelings through her actions as well. She repaired his shirts with careful, neat stitches. She learned his favorite foods and made them without being asked. She would sometimes sing softly while they worked together, old songs that her mother had taught her, and Parker found himself memorizing the melodies. On Sundays, their day of rest, they would often ride out to the creek together and sit by the water, talking for hours about everything and nothing. Parker learned about Florence's childhood, about the mother she had lost when she was 16, about her dreams and fears. Florence learned about Parker's memories of building the ranch with his father, about his mother's determination and strength, about his hopes for the future. "I want to expand the herd," Parker told her one Sunday afternoon in late October as they sat on a blanket by the creek. "Maybe get up to 500 head eventually, and I want to improve the house, add on a proper dining room, maybe even a second story." "That sounds wonderful," Florence said, leaning back on her hands and looking up at the sky. "What about horses? Have you ever thought about breeding horses in addition to cattle?" "I have thought about it," Parker admitted. "There is definitely a market for good horses out here, but it would require more capital to get started, more land devoted to it." "Something to work toward then," Florence said. Parker corrected gently. Florence turned to look at him, a smile playing at her lips. She agreed. As October turned to November, the weather began to cool, and Parker knew winter would be coming soon, even to the Arizona territory. He needed to make sure everything was prepared, that they had enough hay stored, enough supplies laid in, that the cattle were in good condition to weather the leaner months. But more than that, he needed to make his intentions toward Florence clear and official. They had been courting for over a month now, and while it had been wonderful, Parker wanted more. He wanted permanence. He wanted to be able to call Florence his wife, not just his partner or his sweetheart. The problem was, he had no ring to offer her, no fancy way to propose. His mother's wedding ring was buried with her, as his father had requested, so Parker did not even have a family heirloom to present. All he had was his love and his ranch and his hope that it would be enough. He finally decided that simple honesty was the best approach, the most true to who they were as people. One evening in mid-November, after they had finished dinner and were sitting together by the fireplace, Parker took Florence's hand and began to speak. "Florence, I know we have only known each other for 3 months. Some people might say that is not long enough to make a lifetime decision. But I feel like I have known you longer, like you have always been meant to be here with me. You make me laugh. You make me think. You make me want to be a better man, and I cannot imagine my life without you in it anymore." Florence's eyes had gone wide, and Parker could see her chest rising and falling with quick breaths. "I do not have a ring to give you right now," Parker continued, "and I am not a wealthy man. But I have this ranch, and I have my heart, and both of them are yours if you want them. Florence Wright, will you marry me? Will you be my wife, my partner in all things for the rest of our lives?" For a long moment, Florence just stared at him, and Parker felt his heart hammering against his ribs, terrified that he had misread everything, that she would say no or ask for more time. Then Florence smiled, tears beginning to stream down her face, and said, "Yes, yes, Parker, I will marry you. I would be honored to be your wife." Parker pulled her into his arms, holding her close and feeling her heart beating against his chest. "I love you," he said into her hair. "I love you so much, Florence." "I love you too," she said, pulling back to look into his face. "I did not think I would find this, not after Samuel died. I thought I would spend the rest of my life alone. But then I met you, and you gave me hope again. You gave me a home and a purpose and love. You gave me everything." They kissed then, a gentle kiss that held all the promise of their future together. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling through tears. "We should go to Superior tomorrow," Parker said. "Get you a proper ring and arrange for a minister to perform the ceremony." "I do not need a fancy ring," Florence protested. "Maybe not," Parker agreed. "But I want to give you one anyway. You deserve all the proper things, Florence. You deserve everything good." The next day, they made the trip to Superior together, and Parker felt a profound satisfaction in introducing Florence as his fiancée to the few people they encountered. At the general store, Marcus Webb congratulated them warmly. "I wondered if this might happen when I heard you had hired a woman to work the ranch," Marcus said with a knowing smile. "You two look good together. Your father would have approved, Parker." "I think he would have," Parker agreed, feeling a mix of sadness and happiness at the mention of his father. They found a simple gold band at the general store, nothing fancy but honest and sturdy, like their relationship. Florence tried it on and it fit perfectly, which felt like a good omen. They also arranged for the traveling minister who came through Superior once a month to perform their wedding ceremony on his next visit, which would be in 2 weeks. 2 weeks, Florence said as they rode back to the ranch in the wagon. "That is not much time to prepare." "Do we need to prepare much?" Parker asked. "I thought we would keep it simple, just us and the minister, maybe Marcus as a witness." "That sounds perfect to me," Florence said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I do not need a big ceremony, I just need you." Those 2 weeks passed in a blur of work and planning. Florence sewed herself a new dress for the ceremony, working on it in the evenings by lamplight. Parker cleaned and organized the house until it was more spotless than it had been since his mother was alive. They both felt the anticipation building, the sense that their lives were about to change in fundamental and permanent ways. The night before the wedding, Florence stayed in her room and Parker in his, maintaining propriety for one last night. Parker lay awake for hours, feeling like a boy before Christmas, too excited to sleep. Tomorrow, Florence would become his wife. Tomorrow, they would bind their lives together in the eyes of God and the law. Tomorrow, everything would be official and real. The traveling minister, Reverend Thomas Sawyer, arrived at noon the next day, and they all traveled into Superior for the ceremony. Marcus Webb served as witness, along with his wife Martha, and the ceremony was held in the small church at the edge of town. It was simple and brief, but as Parker stood beside Florence and repeated his vows, as he slipped the gold band onto her finger and heard her speak her own promises, he felt the weight and significance of the moment settle over him like a blessing. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Sawyer said. "You may kiss your bride." Parker cupped Florence's face in his hands and kissed her gently, feeling her smile against his lips. When they pulled apart and turned to face Marcus and Martha, the older couple was smiling warmly. "Congratulations," Martha said, embracing Florence. "May you have many happy years together." They celebrated with a simple meal at the boarding house in Superior, and then Parker and Florence made the journey back to their ranch as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the land. Everything looked the same as it had that morning, but also fundamentally different. This was now their ranch, their home, their shared life. That night, as they lay together in the bedroom that had been Florence's but was now theirs, Parker held his wife close and marveled at the strange turns life could take. 3 months ago, he had been alone and struggling, convinced he was going to lose everything his parents had built. Now he had Florence, had hope, had a future that stretched out bright and full of possibility. "What are you thinking about?" Florence asked, her voice soft in the darkness. "How lucky I am," Parker said honestly. How I went to town looking for a farmhand and found my wife instead." Florence laughed quietly. "I suppose that did not turn out exactly as you planned." "It turned out better," Parker said, kissing the top of her head. "So much better than I ever could have planned." Winter came to the Arizona Territory gently that year, bringing cooler temperatures and occasional rain that kept the grass growing and the creek running strong. Parker and Florence settled into married life with the same natural rhythm they had found as working partners. They divided the ranch work between them based on preference and skill, supporting each other through difficult days and celebrating the small victories. In January, during a trip to Superior for supplies, they encountered a young man asking around about ranch work. His name was Tom Miller, and he had come west from Kansas looking for opportunities. Parker, remembering his own desperate search for help not so many months before, hired Tom on the spot. The additional labor meant Parker and Florence could finally tackle some of the larger projects they had been planning, and it also meant less of the day-to-day burden falling solely on their shoulders. By spring, the ranch was thriving in ways it had not since before Parker's father died. The cattle were healthy and multiplying, the hay stores were good, and Parker had even managed to purchase several quality horses with the intent to start a small breeding program. Florence had expanded her vegetable garden significantly and was selling excess produce in Superior, adding to their income. But the greatest joy came in early summer when Florence told Parker she was pregnant. They were sitting on the porch watching the sunset, as had become their habit, when she took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "There is a baby growing in there," she said softly. "Our baby." Parker felt tears spring to his eyes. "Truly." "Truly," Florence confirmed, smiling at his reaction. "I am about 3 months along, I think. The baby should come in the fall, around October." Parker pulled her into his arms, holding her carefully as if she might break. "I am going to be a father," he said wonderingly. "And I am going to be a mother again," Florence said. Parker pulled back to look at her face. "Again?" Florence bit her lip, looking uncertain for the first time since he had known her. "I should have told you before. I had a baby with Samuel, a little girl. She was born too early and only lived a few hours. It was part of why I left St. Louis, too many painful memories. I am sorry I did not tell you." "Do not be sorry," Parker said, cupping her face in his hands. "I am sorry you went through that, but this time will be different. This baby will be healthy and strong, just like you." "I hope so," Florence said, leaning into his touch. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and Parker watched in awe as Florence's body changed to accommodate their growing child. He insisted she take on lighter tasks as she grew bigger, though Florence protested that she was perfectly capable of continuing her regular work. They compromised, with Florence focusing on things like the garden, the chickens, and household tasks, while Parker and Tom handled the heavier ranch labor. In September, as the weather began to cool again, and the leaves on the cottonwoods along the creek turned golden, Parker rode into Superior to fetch the doctor, a gruff but competent man named Dr. Harold Vance. Florence had started having contractions that morning, and though she insisted everything was fine, Parker was taking no chances. Dr. Vance arrived at the ranch by early afternoon and examined Florence in their bedroom while Parker paced nervously in the main room. Tom had tactfully made himself scarce, heading out to check on the cattle and giving the family privacy. The labor lasted through the afternoon and into the evening, and Parker had never felt so helpless in his life. He could hear Florence's occasional cries of pain through the bedroom door, and each one felt like a knife to his heart. Dr. Vance would emerge periodically to request hot water or clean cloths, his expression professionally neutral and revealing nothing. As the sun set and darkness fell, Parker sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, praying harder than he had ever prayed before. Please let them both be all right. Please let Florence survive this. Please let our baby be healthy. Please, God, please. And then, as the clock struck 9 in the evening, he heard it. The thin, reedy cry of a newborn baby. Parker was on his feet instantly, his heart pounding. He waited what felt like hours but was probably only minutes before Dr. Vance opened the bedroom door, his weathered face breaking into a smile. "You have a son," he said. "A healthy, strong son, and your wife came through just fine. She is tired, but she is all right." Parker felt his knees go weak with relief. "Can I see them?" "Give us just a few more minutes to get them cleaned up and settled," Dr. Vance said. "Then you can come in." When Parker was finally allowed into the bedroom, the sight that greeted him was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Florence lay in bed, her hair damp with sweat and her face pale with exhaustion, but smiling radiantly as she held a tiny bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Parker approached the bed on shaking legs and looked down at the small, red-faced creature in Florence's arms. The baby had a shock of dark hair and was making soft, snuffling sounds, his tiny fists waving in the air. "He is perfect," Parker whispered, reaching out one finger to gently touch his son's impossibly small hand. The baby's fingers wrapped around Parker's finger with surprising strength, and Parker felt his heart expand in his chest until he thought it might burst. "What should we name him?" Florence asked. They had discussed names over the past few months but had not settled on anything definite. Now, looking at his son's face, Parker suddenly knew. "Peter," he said. "Peter Samuel Preston, after my father and your first husband." Florence's eyes filled with tears. "That is perfect," she said. "Peter Samuel, our little Pete." Dr. Vance stayed the night to make sure there were no complications, sleeping in the room that had once been Parker's before he moved into the main bedroom with Florence. In the morning, he examined both mother and baby one more time, pronounced them both healthy, gave Parker instructions on how to care for them, and then rode back to Superior with the promise to check in again in a week. The first weeks with baby Peter were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. The baby needed to be fed every few hours, day and night, and there were diapers to wash and endless laundry, and the constant concern that something might go wrong. But there were also quiet moments of pure joy, like when Peter would fall asleep on Parker's chest, his tiny body warm and trusting, or when Florence would sing lullabies while nursing him, her voice soft and sweet. Tom proved invaluable during this time, taking on extra work without complaint so Parker could spend more time helping with the baby. Parker made a mental note to give him a raise as soon as the ranch finances allowed. As fall turned to winter and winter eventually gave way to spring, Peter grew from a tiny newborn to a chubby, smiling baby who laughed at everything and was beginning to show signs of his mother's determination and his father's stubbornness. Florence regained her strength and gradually returned to her regular activities, though now with a baby strapped to her back in a sling she had sewn for that purpose. The ranch continued to prosper. The cattle herd grew to over 300 head, and the horse breeding program began to show promise with the birth of several fine foals. Parker hired another hand, an older man named Frank Roberts who had decades of ranching experience and served as an invaluable mentor for both Parker and Tom. On their second wedding anniversary, Parker gave Florence a gift he had been working on in secret for months. He led her out behind the house to where a new structure stood, a small building with a sign over the door that read, "Florence's Garden Shed." "I know you have been wanting a place to store your garden tools and supplies," Parker said. and I thought you deserved a proper space just for you." Florence walked into the shed and looked around at the shelves Parker had built, the organized tool racks, the workbench where she could pot plants and prepare seeds. "Parker, this is wonderful," she said, turning to him with shining eyes. "But this must have taken you so much time." "You are worth it," Parker said simply. "You are worth all the time and effort in the world." That night, after Peter was asleep in his small bed, Parker and Florence lay together talking about the future. Florence told him she was pregnant again, and Parker's joy was immeasurable. Their second child, a daughter they named Patricia Grace, was born the following summer, an easy birth compared to Peter's, with the baby arriving quickly and without complications. Patricia had Florence's brown eyes and Parker's strong features, and she seemed determined from birth to keep up with her older brother in all things. Peter, for his part, was fascinated by his baby sister, always wanting to touch her gently and bring her toys. The years flowed by like water in the creek, steady and sure. The ranch grew to be one of the most successful in the region, with a reputation for quality cattle and horses. Tom eventually married a girl from Superior, and Parker built them a small house on the edge of the property so they could stay on permanently. Frank Roberts became like a grandfather to Peter and Patricia, teaching them ranch skills and telling them stories from his long life. Parker and Florence had 2 more children over the years, another son they named Paul and a daughter named Penelope. The house they had expanded twice to accommodate their growing family, adding bedrooms and eventually that second story Parker had dreamed about. But through all the changes and growth, the foundation of everything remained the love between Parker and Florence. They still took time most evenings to sit together, even if now they were surrounded by children rather than enjoying quiet solitude. They still worked side by side when time allowed, still moved in that synchronized rhythm they had found all those years ago. On their 10th wedding anniversary, they made a trip back to Superior and stood outside the general store where Parker had first put up his notice looking for a farmhand. The town had grown considerably over the decade with new buildings and more people, but the general store remained, as did Marcus Webb, who still ran it though he moved a bit slower now. "You remember that day?" Parker asked Florence as they stood on the boardwalk. "Every detail," Florence said, taking his hand. "I remember thinking you were either crazy or an answer to prayer, offering a stranger a job and a place to stay." "Maybe I was both," Parker said with a smile. "Maybe you were," Florence agreed, "but you were also my salvation. You gave me a home when I had nowhere to go. You gave me purpose when I was lost. You gave me love when I thought I would never have it again." "You gave me all those things too," Parker said, pulling her close. "I was so focused on just surviving, on keeping the ranch going, that I had forgotten what it meant to truly live. You reminded me. You taught me that life is not just about work and duty. It is about partnership and joy and building something meaningful together." They stood there for a long moment, holding each other on the street where their story had begun, while around them the world continued its busy motion. Then they walked back to where their children were waiting with Tom's wife Sarah, who had agreed to watch them for the day, and headed home to the ranch that had become so much more than Parker had ever dreamed it could be. Years continued to pass. Peter grew into a strong, capable young man who loved ranch work as much as his father did. Patricia developed a keen mind for business and took over managing the ranch finances, proving herself invaluable. Paul showed an aptitude for horse training that exceeded even Parker's skills, and Penelope had her mother's green thumb, expanding the garden into a true farm operation that supplied much of the surrounding area with produce. Parker and Florence grew older together, their hair turning gray, their faces gaining lines that told the story of years lived fully. But their love never diminished. If anything, it grew deeper and richer with time, like a well that continually refreshed itself. On their 25th wedding anniversary, the whole family gathered for a celebration. The house was full of noise and laughter, with Tom and Sarah and their children, Frank Roberts, who was now quite elderly but still sharp as ever, and various friends from Superior and the surrounding ranches. As the sun began to set, Parker found Florence on the porch, standing at the railing and looking out over the land they had built together. He came up beside her and put his arm around her waist, and she leaned into him with the ease of long practice. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Everything," Florence said softly. "How scared I was that day the stagecoach left me in Superior, how desperate I felt, how I had no idea what I was going to do. And then I showed up with my offer of work," Parker said. "And then you showed up," Florence agreed, turning to look at him. "Do you know what I thought when you first approached me?" "What?" "I thought you looked kind," Florence said. "Tired and worried but kind, and I thought, maybe this is the chance I have been praying for. Maybe this stranger with the kind eyes is going to save me." "Did I?" Parker asked. "Save you? We saved each other," Florence said. "That is how the best partnerships work. Not one person rescuing the other, but both of them lifting each other up." "That is what we have done, is it not?" Parker said wonderingly. "We have lifted each other up." "Every day for 25 years, Florence confirmed. "And I hope we have another 25 years ahead of us to keep doing it." "At least," Parker said, kissing her softly. Inside the house, someone started playing a fiddle and the sound of music drifted out to the porch. Florence and Parker stayed where they were, swaying slightly to the melody, holding each other and watching the sun paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink and purple. "I love you, Florence Preston," Parker said into her hair. "I love you, Parker Preston," Florence replied. "Thank you for hiring me that day." "Thank you for accepting," Parker said. "Best decision I ever made." "Mine too," Florence agreed. They stayed on the porch until the stars began to emerge, bright pinpoints of light in the darkening sky. Then they went inside to rejoin their family, their hands clasped together, their hearts full of gratitude for the life they had built. The years that followed were good ones. There were challenges, of course. There always were. Droughts came and went, cattle prices fluctuated, and there were the normal trials of life. But Parker and Florence faced everything together, just as they always had, and they always found a way through. Peter married a lovely girl from Tucson and took over more of the day-to-day ranch operations, allowing Parker to slow down a bit as age began to take its toll. Patricia married a banker from Phoenix and continued to manage the ranch finances even from a distance. Paul started his own horse training business on a portion of the ranch land Parker deeded to him. And Penelope married a farmer and expanded her produce operation into a thriving business. Parker and Florence became grandparents, and then great-grandparents, their family tree spreading and growing just like the ranch itself had. They watched with pride and satisfaction as their children and grandchildren carried on the work they had started, preserving the legacy while also making it their own. On a warm evening in early October, 35 years after Florence had first arrived in Superior, Parker and Florence sat together on the porch as they had done thousands of times before. They were both in their 60s now, slowed by age but still sharp in mind and spirit. "Do you remember how terrified I was when I realized I was falling in love with you?" Florence asked suddenly. Parker smiled. "I remember being terrified myself. I kept thinking I was your employer, that it was wrong to have those feelings." "I am glad we were both brave enough to be honest," Florence said. "Me too," Parker agreed. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the land they knew so intimately. Every rock, every tree, every bend in the creek was as familiar to them as their own reflections. This place was part of them now, woven into their very beings. "I have been thinking," Florence said after a while, "about that day we met, about how you offered me a job when I was desperate and lost." "I think about that day too," Parker said. "I want you to know," Florence continued, "that you did not just give me a job that day. You gave me a future. You gave me hope. You gave me a reason to keep going when I thought I had lost everything that mattered. And then, over time, you gave me love and partnership and a family and a home. You gave me a whole life, Parker, the best life I could have imagined." Parker felt tears prick his eyes. "You gave me all of that too, Florence. This ranch, this life, it would have meant nothing without you to share it with. You made everything better, everything brighter. I was just surviving before you came along, but you taught me how to live." They held hands and watched the sunset until the last light faded from the sky and the stars emerged in full glory above them. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of cattle settling for the night, horses nickering softly in the barn, and from inside the house, the laughter of grandchildren visiting for the week. "I would do it all again," Florence said softly. "Every single day exactly the same." "So would I," Parker said. "Though maybe I would hire you as my wife from the beginning instead of waiting." Florence laughed, the sound as beautiful to Parker's ears as it had been 35 years ago. "I think we needed that time. We needed to become partners first, to learn to trust each other and work together." "You are probably right," Parker admitted. "You usually are, not always," Florence protested. "You have been right plenty of times too." They went inside as the night deepened, preparing for bed with the easy routine of decades together. As they lay in the darkness, Parker held Florence close and marveled, not for the first time, at the miracle of their life together. He had gone to town looking for a farmhand and found his wife instead. Found his partner, his best friend, his whole world. And in the process, he had built not just a successful ranch, but a legacy of love that would continue long after he and Florence were gone, carried on by their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. As Parker drifted off to sleep, Florence's breathing soft and steady beside him, his last thought was one of profound gratitude. Gratitude for that day in Superior, when desperation and providence had brought them together. Gratitude for every day since, the hard ones and the easy ones, the ones full of joy and the ones touched by sorrow. Gratitude for this life they had built together, one day and one choice at a time, until it had become something beautiful and enduring. Outside, the Arizona night was clear and cool, stars wheeling overhead in their ancient patterns. The ranch slept, the cattle and horses settled, the land resting until morning would bring a new day of work and life. And in the house at the center of it all, Parker and Florence Preston slept peacefully. Two people who had found each other against all odds and built a love that would last for all their days and beyond. A testament to the power of courage, kindness, and the willingness to take a chance on a stranger in a dusty Arizona town on a late September day in 1885.